Catherine Louise Martin was born on October 25, 1959. Her family and friends referred to her as Kathy. Kathy met Mike Odom in high school when they were 16 years old. They dated for a while and then decided to marry. Before they could get married, Mike was arrested for selling heroin. He sold it to an undercover officer. He was sentenced to 6 years for this crime, but only served 2. Kathy told her family that she was set on marrying him when he got released. 2 years later, when he was freed, they did end up marrying. Kathy and Mike had 2 children together, Tasha and Sean. They lived in Harris County, Texas. Kathy's father, Frankie Martin, decided to give Mike a job at his sign business. Kathy did everything to ensure the marriage worked. She was also described as a loving mother who would have done anything for her kids. On the night of March 3, 1987, Mike tried to contact Kathy. He was out of town working. Kathy was supposed to be home with the children, so it was alarming to him when she did not answer the phone. Mike called their next-door neighbor and asked him to check up on Kathy and their children. The neighbor knocked on the door, but there was no answer. He looked in through the windows and saw that the television was still on. Instead of calling police, the neighbor drove into town, found a policeman, and they both drove back to the Odom's house. The officer found the front door to be unlocked. He entered the house, and inside of the living room sofa was 4-year-old Tasha. She had been beaten badly and unconscious, but was fortunately still alive. 2-month-old Sean was found unharmed in his bedroom. In Kathy and Mike's bedroom, the officer found Kathy's battered, naked body. She was covered in blood. Kathy had been severely beaten and stabbed more than 16 times. She had also been strangled, assaulted, and her wrists were bound with a cord to a lamp. Officers feared that the person responsible for this would come back and finish the job they started with Tasha. Both Tasha and Sean were taken to the hospital. It was ordered that they could not be left alone. Kathy's father, Frankie, arrived at the crime scene. He was told to go to the hospital to be with his grandchildren. While at the hospital, Frankie learned about what happened to his daughter on a TV screen. Meanwhile, back at the house, Mike finally arrived. Policemen paid special attention to his appearance. One of the officers noted that Mike had several red stains on his shirt. It looked like blood. A search of the Odom's house revealed blood in the bathroom. The perpetrator, possibly Mike, had attempted to clean up before leaving. Police found no sign of a break-in. All doors were locked except for the front door. This indicated that Kathy knew the person that took her life. The fact that she was stabbed so many times also told investigators it was a personal crime. Kathy's clothes told police something about what happened. They were found neatly folded on the floor. Investigators theorized that the perpetrator attacked Tasha in order to get whatever he wanted from Kathy. Back at the hospital, Tasha was in critical condition. She was in a coma and was reliant on IVs. While doctors worked on saving her life, investigators focused on her father, Mike Odom. He appeared emotional and distraught, but investigators had their doubts about him from the start. Investigators discovered that Mike did not come straight home from work like he said he would. He had gone out with friends of his. To investigators, it was something they had seen before. An individual arranging a slaying, being at a different location, then calling someone else to go check in on the victim. Mike's clothing was taken to the forensic lab for testing. That was not all. Investigators also found strange stains on the car floor of the neighbor, Tim Robinson. It was clear to investigators. Tim and Mike conducted a plan to take Kathy's life. Perhaps Mike was using again and was seeking insurance money. But there was soon a twist in the case. The medical examiner estimated that Kathy's life was taken around 6 hours before her body was found. That would be about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Both Mike and Tim claimed to be at work at the time. While investigators checked their alibis, a witness came forward. That witness is 4-year-old Tasha Odom. She emerged from her coma and told investigators that she remembers a man entering the house. Tasha said the man had yellow hair. Neither Mike Odom nor Tim Robinson had blonde hair. Unfortunately, the man's hair color was all Tasha could remember. When the forensic tests came back, it showed that the stains in Tim's car were motor oil. The stains on Mike's shirt was paint. Furthermore, co-workers provided solid alibis for both Mike and Tim. Each of them also passed polygraph tests. The two of them were then ruled out, and investigators could move on to the next person. That next person was not very hard to find. Kathy had a sister, Shelley Martin. She was married to Greg Markwart. They met thanks to Mike. Greg and Mike had been close since they were both in the drug scene. Like Kathy, Shelley was also 16 when she met the man she would marry. Greg was 25 years old at the time, which should have been a red flag already. Greg and Shelley married in 1983. Soon after, both Shelley and Kathy got addicted, just like Greg and Mike. Greg and Shelley were known to steal from her parents for money. Greg had been raised by a wealthy aunt and uncle, and the aunt repaid the Martins the money, and everyone agreed not to file charges. While Mike and Kathy had turned their lives around, Greg and Shelley did not. They were in and out of jail frequently. Shortly before Kathy's life was taken, she told a friend that Greg and Shelley had been over recently, and that while Shelley was in the other room with the baby, Greg had made advances towards her, which she of course rejected. When questioned, Greg would claim that on the night of the crime, at the times in which he was not with his wife, he was with a man named Hampton Robinson III. In an unimportant but interesting note, Robinson was a friend of Charles Harrelson. Harrelson was the father of actor Woody Harrelson, and in 1982 was convicted of slaying a judge. In fact, Robinson had testified against Harrelson at his trial. There was ample evidence that Greg had been in the house. They found his fingerprints and his hair throughout the crime scene. There was only one problem. As a family member who had been in the house numerous times, this did not prove a thing. Kathy's parents told investigators that they believed Greg was responsible. Frankie said that 2 days after Kathy's slaying, he received a phone call in the middle of the night from the hospital where Tasha was being treated, telling him that Shelley and Greg had come to visit. Frankie told them to not allow admittance. First, because he was suspicious of Greg, but also the fact that no one had a reason to be there at 3 a.m, especially them. Tasha's grandmother, Charlene Martin, who was at the hospital, recalled what happened. When Tasha saw Greg, she became very scared, and he was ordered to leave. Investigators asked Tasha if it was her uncle Greg that she saw inside their house with Kathy on the day of the attack. Unfortunately, she could not remember. Investigators tried many techniques, but due to her head injury, she could not remember a thing. While Greg denied any involvement when talking to investigators, he was surprisingly open about his attraction to Kathy, particularly to one part of her body. Greg had a thing for Kathy's stomach. This fixation was so obvious that Kathy had even mentioned it to her friends. Interestingly enough, Kathy was mainly stabbed in the stomach. At one point during the interview, Greg asked to leave to put more money in a parking lot meter. He never came back. He also refused a polygraph. Investigators decided to look into his alibi. Shelley said that Greg drove her to school at 10:30 a.m. on the day of the crime and picked her up again at 2:30 p.m. This 4-hour window was more than enough time for Greg to commit the crime. And as you'll remember, the medical examiner determined that her life was taken around 1 p.m. that day. Even though Kathy was assaulted, this crime occurred years before DNA was widely used in cold case investigations. At the time, they were using serology. Basically, they were doing blood group typing. It was very difficult to do, and you need a very large sample. You'd still just get a blood type, which was not very conclusive. The blood type from the evidence collected from Kathy's body was consistent with Greg Marquardt's blood type. He was type O, as well as the perpetrator. About 50% of the population has the same blood type, so it did not tell investigators much. Without more evidence, the case sadly went cold for some time. For Frankie, it was especially difficult, believing that the man who took his daughter's life was married to his other daughter. In 1998, a cold case team was formed, and one of the first cases they looked at was that of Kathy Odoms. By then, DNA testing was dependable enough to generate a DNA profile from the biological evidence in Kathy's case. Tests showed that Greg Marquardt was part of the 2% of the general population who could have been the perpetrator. Still not conclusive, but a lot better than 50%. Greg quickly came up with an explanation to investigators. He claimed that he and Kathy were having a consensual affair. Greg said that he was with her on the morning her life was taken. He insisted that she was alive when he left. Greg was not arrested at the time because even though investigators did not believe him, they were concerned that they did not have enough for a conviction. They had to prove that he was present when the crime was committed. Investigators reached out to Catherine Long, who worked for Orchard Cellmark, a private forensic lab in Dallas, Texas. Catherine came up with an unusual strategy to try and solve Kathy's crime. She and her colleagues were strangling each other. Let me explain. They wanted to determine if a perpetrator would deposit skin cells in the act of choking a victim. They realized that there was indeed a significant transfer of skin cells from the perpetrator to the victim. Investigators needed to find something in Kathy's evidence file that would have contained the perpetrator's skin cells. They decided to do tests on the electrical cord that was used to bind Kathy's hands. In an incredible piece of luck, the cord had been stored in a paper bag and not a plastic bag. The paper bag provides breathability so that there is not any moisture on the item inside, and it's going to stay dry. That will therefore prolong the DNA life. It will actually preserve the DNA longer than if it were in a plastic bag. The cord was covered in blood. Investigators swabbed the cord to obtain all the evidence they could. Testing revealed 2 genetic profiles, that of Kathy Odom and that of Greg Marquardt's. The only way Marquardt's DNA could be on the cord was if, in fact, he was the perpetrator. Finally, on December 18, 2002, Greg Marquardt was arrested and charged with taking Kathy's life. While in prison, Marquardt confessed to a fellow inmate. He said that he was high on heroin when he drove to Kathy's house that day. Once inside, he made advances that she rejected. To force her to comply, he struck Tasha repeatedly in the head. He then threatened to take Sean's life as well. In order to save her children's lives, she had to comply. With a knife from the kitchen, Marquardt then cut the electrical cord from the lamp and tied Kathy's hands. After he assaulted her, he took her life. Marquardt then cleaned up in the bathroom and changed into Mike Odom's clothing. Little did he know that advances in DNA technology would be used to identify him as the perpetrator 15 years later. 6 months after his arrest, Greg's wealthy aunt passed away, leaving him hundreds of thousands of dollars and part ownership of her home. The Martins decided to file a suit against him, and it tied up the estate, which prevented him from using those funds towards his defense. In 2004, Greg Marquardt pled guilty, and he was convicted of all the charges against him. In July of the same year, he was sentenced to 45 years in prison. He passed away of liver disease after serving 4 years of his sentence in 2008. He was 56 years old. Sergeant Roger Wadsworth was quoted as saying, "Couldn't happen to a nicer guy." Shelley and her parents lost contact after the crime. She took Marquardt's side while they believed he was responsible. It was said that for a long time, Shelley continued to support Marquardt and believed in his innocence. A few years after the crime, the Martins moved to Oklahoma. A few years after that, it seemed that Shelley made up with her parents, and she too moved to Oklahoma to be near her parents. Kathy's father, Frankie, said, "It does not bring back Kathy. I will always remember her, the house she put together, and the things we did. It is always tough to lose a child."